The subject is divine inspiration. Is it a fallacy? Is it real? I am speaking with Bensei Nane, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Bensei Nane is my guest. We will be talking about creativity. I've talked about creativity in assorted forms over the years. This time we're going to be focusing a little bit maybe on the divine inspiration, something I've always thought is a fallacy that a lot of artists like to put their creativity out there and pluck it down from the heavens. But Bensei, as I usually like to do, I want to give him a few minutes to say who he is, what he does, and any opening thoughts on the subject. So welcome. If you can just give a little background about yourself.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Bence Nane. I am a professor of philosophy at the University of Antwerp, where I also co-direct the Center for Philosophical Psychology. I'm also the director of the European Network for Sensory Research. I mainly work in aesthetics and philosophy of mind, and also in cognitive science and philosophy of cognitive science. That's my background, and I guess the reason why I'm here is because I have been writing a little bit about creativity, and I have an account that I call experiential account of creativity that does at least try to explain this, what I take to be an illusion of this kind of divine origins of creativity. So this is probably what we're going to get into soon.
Yeah, I was looking on some of the stuff, some of the pages where you have your information, your university page, a few other organizations, and you talk about imagination and prefer the term mental imagery. But imagination and creativity are not necessarily the same things. Creativity is more directed towards a particular end or goal, whereas you can just be lazing on a summer afternoon and imagining this, that, or the other thing. So why don't we start with the idea, is imagination something that undergirds creativity?
Good. That's a big topic in creativity research. So very hip these days because as people who tune into this channel might know, there's been a lot of talk about this phenomenon called aphantasia these days. Have you heard about aphantasia, Dan?
I've heard the term. I'm not familiar with
Right.
the
So aphantasia is the condition when so if I ask you to close your eyes and visualize an apple, can you do that for me?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see something apple-like?
Yes.
Good. So that means that you can voluntarily conjure up mental imagery. Not everyone can do that. About 5 to 8% of the population, when I ask them to close their eyes and visualize an apple, nothing comes up.
Actually, yes, I actually saw a video. I'm thinking now about a week and a half ago about that, one of those videos about, do you know this about the mind or something?
Right. It's a big thing these days. There's been a lot of research on this, and it's a huge, very hip topic in psychology and even neuroscience. There's been some neuroscientific studies on this. But if that happens, if you close your eyes and if there's just no mental imagery in your mind, doesn't mean that you're not creative, not at all. And many visual artists, in fact, some very high-profile animators are working at Pixar. They do have aphantasia. They do not have mental imagery. So it would be really silly to say that somehow imagination is necessary for creativity. It clearly isn't. Creativity is a very complex phenomenon. You can achieve it with the help of imagination. You can achieve it in other ways. And the other way around, as you very rightly pointed out, imagination can be used in a number of different ways. Creativity might be one of them, but daydreaming, as you said, is another one where that has very little to do with creativity. So I think of imagination as creativity as, two phenomena that can be related, but you can have one without the other, and you can have the other without one.
Well, as applies to aphantasia, that would be mostly then mental projection, seeing an image. As a poet, for example, as example, I'll sometimes get an idea for a piece of writing, whether it's poetry or prose, that is based upon sound, alliteration, assonance, consonants, which again is not going to have anything to do with visualizing a T or something.
Good, very good. So aphantasia, as it became famous, is a visual thing. So and that's how I was trying to get you to experience this. Close your eyes and visualize an apple. That's visual aphantasia. But of course, we have visual imagery when you close your eyes. Visual example that you have auditory imagery. So, for example, when you are reciting your favorite line of poems in your head, that's auditory imagery. When you hear a melody that you really like in your mind's ear, that would be auditory imagery. And some people who are categorized as aphantasics, they also like that, or sometimes they only like that. In fact, some people who are very amusical, the issue there is the kind of musical or auditory aphantasia. So they hear everything very well, but they don't have the ability to have kind of auditory or musical mental imagery. That's a quite an interesting phenomenon that we're just beginning to understand.
And that would also seem to me to tie into something like synesthesia, because I know some people can see sounds, some people can smell ideas or something. It triggers something in them, and it may be unique to just them on the whole planet, or maybe a handful of people can do that. Have you dealt with synesthesia in your work?
Yeah, I've been writing about synesthesia, and you're right. That's a very interesting link to aphantasia. The more So they basically inversely correlated. So if you're more likely to have aphantasia, you're less likely to have synesthesia. If you're less likely to have synesthesia, you're more likely to have aphantasia. In fact, so aphantasia, as we talked about it, is the condition when you can't have, when you don't seem to have conscious mental imagery. Now, there are some people whose mental imagery is so vivid that they often even kind of confuse it with reality. Yeah. And it also has a funky name. It's called hyperphantasia. And there seems to be a very strong association between hyperphantasia and synesthesia. So those people who have this extremely strong, extremely vivid mental imagery, they often are also the ones who have synesthesia. So that's an interesting correlation.
Now, I'm just going to go off topic just for a bit, okay. And then try to reel it back in here. I've worked many years in a lot of blue-collar jobs and a few white-collar jobs here and there. And, for example, I have been working in retail and ordering things. So let's say if I was ordering milk for the next delivery, I would get an image of just how much milk volume-wise there is, and then my mind would automatically split it into the U.S. quarts, gallons, and whatnot. And I could just do that by seeing what we had left on the shelves. Now, I bring this up just apropos of artificial intelligence, because some companies I've worked for, especially now in the last few years, use artificial intelligence to order, and the ordering is terrible because they don't account. Their mind doesn't account for the nuances of customer likes or dislikes, whether or not stuff was sent in and it's going outdated soon or whatnot. So if you if you just relied on the artificial intelligence, you'd be out of stuff and whatnot. Whereas if someone like myself who has that thing can order better. So I'm just wondering, and again, this is just off the topic based upon what you brought up. I'm just wondering, is that something that artificial intelligence is going to be limited by, that it won't have these aphantasia or synesthesia, these things that seem to be wired into a biological brain, but not necessarily accounted for in algorithms?
So the example that you bring up is very cool. So and I would not think of it as either synesthesia or aphantasia or hyperphantasia. I would think of it as visual skills and imaginative skills. So it's a skill, right? You were not born being able to do that. But the more you did it, the more you were looking at these, empty shelves and how much was remaining. The more you acquire the skill of kind of estimating how much is needed, and that's been a big, huge topic, and especially in perceptual psychology, visual skills, and much more recently, imaginative skills. So visual skills, like one kind of standard example is the radiologist, who when you're a doctor in training, you're just about to study radiology, you see an X-ray picture, you have no idea what's going on. If people kind of point out this is this, then you can kind of follow. And 10 years later, after you completed your training, you can just have a very brief glance at it, and you know exactly what is going on, what kind of, where the tumor is or whatever. And it's been experimentally studied extremely thoroughly this phenomenon of how that works. It's clearly a purely visual phenomenon, a visual learning. Your visual recognitional skills are changing, and I think that's part of what's going on. But in your example, in the example of ordering the milk cartons, what's also happening is something that's often called as imaginative skills. So the same thing as what's happening in perception, that you can acquire a certain skill to see certain things in a way that is beneficial to you. The same is going on for imagination. So you can imagine things in a way that's beneficial to you. You can learn to imagine things better.
Well, would that not be something that's latent? For example, the ability to, let's say, be synesthetic, the ability to look and see milk sort of floating in the air and know how much it is, or to use a more obvious example, someone like Beethoven who had hearing and learned musicality, then went totally deaf, that still remained with him. So isn't it more like you may have a tendency to be an alcoholic, but if you never take a drop of drink, you're never going to become an alcoholic, but there is the latent potential for you too.
Fair enough. I'm sure that there are interpersonal differences, so differences between you and me in terms of how much we're going to be able to pick these things up. But again, a lot depends on how much you're training yourself or how much people train you. And I think, none of these things are things that you're born with, but you can acquire it. And again, some people may pick it up more easily. Some people may pick it up. It's more difficult for people to pick up, and that's actually been studied a little bit when it comes to imaginative skills. So, and that's weirdly enough, that it depends on how well you can acquire these imaginative skills. For example, the skill of when you're wrapping some. That is hopefully a relatable example. You have to wrap a gift, and then you have to tear off as much wrapping paper that would be enough to cover the gift. That's an estimation that requires your imagination a little bit, right? So you need to somehow your mental imagery. You have to exercise mental imagery that I have to tear off this much or this much or this much. You have to somehow imagine how much would be needed, and this is something that people can again acquire. This. No one is born knowing how to do this, but people are much quicker to acquire these kinds of skills, these imaginative skills. Depends on really prosaic things like the size of your visual cortices. So visual cortex is a part of the brain that's kind of the first stop of visual processing, and how quickly you're acquiring these visual skills depends on, or these imaginative skills depends on the size of your visual cortex. Which is nice correlation.
So before we talk about why or why not divine inspiration exists or is useful, let's talk about the historical idea of it. Because the basic idea is that you or any creator, whether it's an artist or I guess a scientist coming up with a theory, that you are not the generative force, you are not the demiurge, you are merely an antenna, a receiver of something that's out there. And a lot of people say, well, anyone can do this. Now, if you're telling me that anyone could make films like Stanley Kubrick or anyone could dance the way a prima ballerina dances, that's obvious folly. You have to have a certain, tendency to be able to do that, a talent level to do that. Where do you think that the idea that all art comes from the Lord or what some higher being, higher essence came from originally?
Well, so actually, yeah, you're right. It's a very old idea. People attribute it to Plato, maybe even older. And I have an account of or some hypotheses about why people think this way, and that's because creative acts, they often strike us as something that we're doing is not coming from the inside. And of course, if it's not coming from the inside, then where is it coming from? One idea is it's coming from God or some kind of divine sources. Of course, another one, which is much more popular in the last 100 years or so, or 150 years by now, is that, of course, it's coming from the unconscious. And I think this is something that we might want to talk about a little bit, because I think that that's the most important recent kind of alternative to this divine inspiration fallacy or divine inspiration theory, that it's not coming from me, but it's also not coming from God, because there is no God. it's coming from my unconscious. So it is somehow outside of what I'm aware of, but it's coming from below, as it were. And I think that the reason for this is that I think the very important feature of creativity, and this is kind of my theory, is that, and that is very, very clear when it comes to, for example, problem solving, so more scientific creativity than artistic creativity, is that you're trying to solve a problem, you're trying this, you're trying that, and then you're just not making progress. And then all of a sudden, you think of something that you have not thought of before. And I think this experience, which you can call this aha experience, when something comes to your mind that you have not, you thought before was impossible, you have not thought of that before. That does give you the experience that it's somehow coming from the outside. After all, you've been trying everything before, and now all of a sudden you are trying something that you have not tried before, and you did not think that was possible before. And that kind of gives you the experience that whatever you're doing now is not coming from the inside, it's coming from somewhere else. God, unconscious, somewhere.
I've always thought of it. I don't know if it's a real theoretical term, but I call it the fallacy of self-limits. Let's say that you and I are arguing over who's stronger or whatnot, and we decide to go to a gym, and I bench press 250 pounds, and I say, no man alive could outlift me, and you come along, you do 300, and I say, no fair, he cheated, it's impossible for him, this sounds very Donald Trumpian, of course, but it's impossible for Benson to outlift me, he's having some help. And so I think, apropos of the arts, but in even a more prosaic thing like lifting or weights, people always think that they are the end all and be all, and if someone is better than that and can lift more or run faster or play chess better or whatever, that somehow they're cheating. And if they're cheating, maybe they're making a little deal with Satan, or maybe God is putting his thumb on the scale to tip it in their favor. What do you think of that as maybe a reason for some of this?
So I think what you're saying is definitely the case. I'm certain about the link to creativity, but so just to give you some reason to think that you're very much right in thinking that that's the way we are wired. So that's some very interesting experiments where two people have to play a certain video game where the outcome depends on both me and the person who I'm playing with. So let's say that there's a cursor that we have to put in some limited area, and you have some impact on the cursor and I have some impact on the cursor. If I succeed, I attribute the success more to myself. If I fail, so if we succeed, I attribute this success to myself. If we fail, I attribute the failure to you. That's just a very universally true and very unfortunate, very sad fact about joint actions. That if you're performing a joint action, if it fails, then you are at fault. If it succeeds, then it's my doing. So I think that we just have a natural tendency to really kind of think of ourselves as better than other people. And then the other phenomenon that's very much related to this is that we are just systematically over-representing our own abilities. Yeah. We all think so. There's some studies about this. So
that's that Dunning-Kruger thing.
Well, the Dunning-Kruger is a bit overused, and it's it's not as simple as some of the memes suggest. Yeah. But what is very well documented is that, for example, close to 80% of drivers think that they're better than average drivers. So 30% was clearly wrong. And students, it's not just about drivers. So like university professors, I'm a university professor. Something like 92% of university professors think that they're better than average teachers. Mm. So there's clearly many of us are delusional. So do I. I think I'm better than average teachers. And high school students, they again 90-something% think that they're more popular than average, and something like 20% thinks that they're in the top 1% of the most popular people. So it's people tend to have a much more positive view of themselves than it's justified. So that's definitely true. I'm struggling to see the link to creativity though. So the idea is that when I'm doing something, Yeah. Can you say more about the link to creativity?
Well, yeah. So over the years, having been in artistic circles for decades now, famously, and you can look at famous writers or famous artists who hated each other, even though they were both great, let's say. And
Mm.
I think the link is that uh, when people see someone doing something great, if you believe that you're just the receiver of the thing and not the demiurge, the creator,
Ah, yeah,
why is the cosmos, why is the Lord, why is whatever favoring this person and not me? And I think there is that. This is why I call it the divine inspiration fallacy. Is that I think there is that wiredness into people's brains that if we're not the creator, then we're not responsible. And if we're just the receivers, and I'm not getting the great novel, or I'm not getting the great dance moves or whatever, and person A is, there is an inherent unfairness in the cosmos, and I think this is why you get
I see.
artists oftentimes. Uh, you can have legitimate criticisms of even a great work of art, but a lot of times you get this petty nonsense that just spills over.
Okay, so I see. So the idea is that the other person gets the divine inspiration and not me.
Right, and you know the old saying, it's not enough for me to succeed, but you must fail. If two of us are succeeding, then something's wrong. You know, if I'm going to be the greatest opera librettist, you damn well can't be.
Right. Okay. I mean, I don't know. I used to hang out with artists, and I feel that I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing, but people seem to have much more prosaic explanation for why the other person succeeds. That they slept with the producer, or rather than they got the divine inspiration. But yeah, I may be wrong about this. So I was thinking and I think that historically, definitely, when people talk about the divine inspiration, the idea is that it's the artist who feels the divine inspiration. It's not that the artist attributes the divine inspiration to the rival artist. And the idea is that I'm feeling something now that I didn't before. Here's an option now. Here's a possibility now that I could not see before. How could I not see this before? It wasn't. It's the same mind. It must be coming from somewhere else. And I think that the whole aha experience, when you're, I don't know, very prosaic example, you're doing a little Sudoku and you're completely stuck. And then all of a sudden you see that, aha, it's like here. Then it seems like, you considered all the possibilities before and you did not see that. And now all of a sudden you do see it. Where does that come from? Not from the inside, because I already considered all the possibilities. So it must come from God, or it must come from my subconscious or something like that.
Well, see, I would turn to John Keats and his ideas of negative capability, which prosaically and mostly people think of as just being okay with being uncertain about things. But creatively speaking, negative capability manifests itself when you take two things. Let's say if you're using a metaphor, taking two things and putting them together in some sort of a metaphor that no one's ever put them together before. And you'd say, well, before I read that line by so and so poet, or before I saw the way that scene played out in that film, I would never have thought of something like that. Because most of the time, even in a well-made film, for example, we see archetypal characters, we see archetypal situations. They may be just better than they've been done in the past, but we're familiar with it. But when we take two things that we've never thought of before, smush them together, and we go, aha, obviously, oh, wow, man, that's obvious. I get it. That's to me what Keats was talking about with negative capability, and I think it comes from the person, the creator, the artist. But maybe it's the artists themselves have a kind of thing where they're like, I'm just if you're Franz Kafka, I'm just a lowly clerk or something. I couldn't do that, and they talk about it oftentimes in terms, sometimes explicitly, of God coming to them or something coming to them, and I just don't. To me, this is something that's evolved.
So I think we're exactly on the same page. I also think of this divine inspiration as a fallacy or as an illusion.
Yeah.
But in order to understand it, we need to understand why we are prone to that illusion, right?
Mm.
And I think this example of like two ideas that seem to be completely unrelated until now, and suddenly they all make sense. That's a great example for something that it's very easy to see why people are tempted to attribute this to some kind of divine intervention
Oh,
or
no
the
doubt.
intervention of the subconscious or something like that. Because, you looked at these two things before, they had nothing to do with each other, and then suddenly you look away and then you look back and then they have something to do with together. And then, but something must have happened, right? And what did happen?
Yeah.
It must be coming from outside. So I think it's a very tempting thing to think. Um, Again, it's illusion. It's an illusion. It's clearly not the case that some kind of divine intervention happened, but it's a tempting way to take. Just to say a little bit more about the whole connecting two ideas, I think it's a great example because it applies to these two forms of creativity. So in creativity research, it's kind of unfortunate that some people are more interested in scientific creativity and then they're only interested in scientific creativity. Some other people are interested in artistic creativity and then they're only interested in artistic creativity. And these two groups of researchers, they often don't really talk to each other. Whereas I think that this general structure of two ideas that seem to have nothing in common, and then suddenly they all make sense if you put them together. That's a pattern that's there in scientific creativity, but also in artistic creativity. So that was famously the big surrealist idea, right? The meeting of an umbrella and a sewing machine on whatever it was, the famous Andre Breton quote. There's two ideas that are clearly have nothing to do with each other, and then suddenly, if you put them together, they really make sense, and they are very artistically creative. But that's also what's happening in science very often. So let's take biology and evolutionary theory. So the general gloss in the birth of evolutionary theory is that was Darwin who came up with the idea of natural selection, and that was Mendel who came up with the theory of genes. And these things were treated as completely independent theories. They were taught at different departments at the university. And then around the middle of the 20th century, along came a bunch of philosophers, among them Ernst Mach, who kind of put the two things together. And that's what biology is as we know it. It came from this kind of smushing together of two ideas that really seem to have nothing to do with each other. And I actually, so Meyer was in a just different generation, but I happened to have met him when he was literally 100-year-old and sat next to him at a conference dinner. And when I asked him about this, he started talking about surrealism and how that move was very similar to what the surrealists were doing when they put together these two completely unrelated ideas. So I think it's a really important thing to think of scientific creativity and artistic creativity as something kind of structurally similar. And I think the example that you mentioned about two unrelated ideas suddenly make sense, the connection between them suddenly making sense is a good example of that.
Well, we've talked about inspiration as something sort of that's coming from us, but I'm wondering if the idea of putting the idea of divine inspiration is also a way to protect ourselves in this manner. There's the old saying that the nail that stands out gets hammered down. And in society, we like to have conformity. Here in the U.S. and I'm certain in the West, there's a growing anti-intellectual bias that's been going on for decades. And I'm just wondering if you if you are an artist or if you're a scientist and you come up with a great theory or you come up with a great painting, and if you were to say, well, let me explain this to you. You know, this is my masterpiece. You're going to get a lot of blowback. You're going to get people saying, "Oh boy, he's a real arrogant bastard." His theory, is garbage or whatnot. So in order to do that, we say, "Well, it's not coming from me. It just came from nowhere." And I'm wondering if, in a sense, the way of sort of offloading the responsibility for coming up with the great work or the great theory is a way to protect ourselves from a society that will hammer you down if you stand out.
Interesting. So, yeah, I haven't thought of that connection. I think different art forms have different attitude to conformity, but I think you're right that there's, unfortunately, there's been a push towards conformity very heavily. So, for example, in I understand that you're in literature, and then I think what literary agents often do is they try to push you in a certain direction that you can package in a way that the editors are going to be able to relate to. They kind of trim away at the very creative bits. In film, that's definitely the case. You know, if you want to get money, you have to present your ideas in a way that people can be relate to, that you can be relatable to for the producers, for the people who would provide the money. In music, maybe a little less so, I guess. I'm not entirely sure. But in visual arts, for example, I think that one very important mark of success in visual arts is that your work is recognizable. So you have to somehow create a certain brand and then stick to it. And again, if you're too creative, then you're not going to be able to create a recognizable brand. So I think that there's this push towards conformity, and that kind of stifles creativity, which in itself I think it's a really interesting and important thing to think about or to talk about. Whether the whole divine inspiration is a way of kind of protecting, or whether it's kind of that pushes you this direction, I'm less sure about. But I can see how it could work that way. That
Well, it could
it's not my
backfire
fault. Don't point
because
at me.
yeah,
It's not my fault. I
yeah,
just I just received the word of God.
and of course it could backfire because he thinks he's the chosen one by the Lord.
Mm, mm. Exactly. And I mean, how much better is that to say that, well, God spoke to me, rather than just yeah. I mean, it depends on the artistic circles, but I wonder whether it's a good move to say that.
Uh, Ben, I've read that you also do film criticism. What do you think is any link between criticism and creativity? Do you view them as 180-degree opposites? Obviously, criticism is writing or putting forth ideas, so there's going to be a structure there too. But it's not necessarily going to be as obviously creative as writing that great novel. Can you talk a little bit about your criticism and how your criticism has informed your views of creativity?
Sure. So I no longer do that much criticism because I just had to choose at some point between academia and being a critic, and I chose academia for better or for worse. But I think that there's really interesting link, and there's some different film critics see that link very differently. So Pauline Kael famously thought that film criticism is really a form of art. I think that's a terrible view. I don't. I mean, I don't know. I don't pick up a piece of film criticism in order to somehow engage with an artwork. I pick it up because I want to know more about or know something about the work that I'm engaging with. I have a view about what critics should do or do that's very, very heavily influenced by my work as a critic. And I think what critics should do is to point out the aesthetically relevant properties, aesthetically relevant features of the work of art in a way that will make the reader see the work of art differently. So I think that if a critic does his or her job well, then that's exactly what happens. I don't know, you watch the film, you read the review, and then you watch the film again, and then you're gonna see it differently and see it as a better work or get more out of it, because you're gonna be attending to different things on the basis of what the critic had said before. I think that's what the critic should do. If the critic does not do that, then they don't do their job. If the critic is writing about their childhood experiences, or that this film reminded me of my time in south of France or whatever, that's not what the critic is supposed to do. If the critic is writing an artistic essay about the film, then the critic is not doing its job. So I think the critic should help the reader in having a better experience of the artwork.
What role do you think that emotion plays in creativity? And I ask this because oftentimes I've debated people, and I'll say, well, there's this false dichotomy that thinks that emotion and intellect are two different ways to view things. To me, for example, to look at a very intellectual movie, I'll use 2001 Stanley Kubrick's film, and to me, one of the most emotional moments in film or scenes in films is when the astronaut is pulling out the mind of the rogue AI there, and the AI house starts degenerating into a childlike mental state. Even though we know this AI has killed, there's something wrong with this AI. To me, it's a terrific moment, and yet I'm always reading about that film and Kubrick's work in general about how emotionless it is, and I just never bought that. I could point out three or four other famous scenes in his films that I think are really rife with emotion, and yet most people remove that because they either fall on one side, emotion or intellect, and they can't do what Keats did and bring those two ends together. What is your thought on something like that?
Totally agree about everything said. So let's start with Kubrick. So I think I think it's preposterous to think of Kubrick as non-emotional. Uh, I I think the use of music in his film is in itself. He's going out of his way to use extremely emotionally charged music in every single one of his films, from the Purcell in in Clockwork Orange to the Schubert in Barry Lyndon, and it's just extremely emotional. I would say I don't think it would be an exaggeration to think of Kubrick as one of the most emotional film directors, in fact. So when people are describing him as this kind of arch intellectual, I think you're right. It's kind of based on this kind of false dichotomy. And as to emotion and intellect, so one of the courses that I teach, that's exactly structured around that. That, for centuries, people have been thinking about the mind as, have emotions and beliefs, or, passion and intellect, or the touchy-feely and the rational. And there's been always this kind of dichotomy and that kind of goes on to pop science these days, left brain, right
Yeah.
brain, which, by the way, neuroscientifically speaking, is complete bullshit.
Yeah.
Can I say bullshit?
Yeah, go ahead.
Complete poppycock. But that's just, this whole dichotomy is just wrong, and we have a lot of reasons to think that our emotional life is much more organized and rational in some ways than we think. It's not the case that emotions just kind of wash over us and we have no control, and this is this kind of like the divine inspiration that is kind of coming from the outside. There's a lot of things that we do with our emotions. There's emotional regulation, which is a huge topic in psychology, about how we can, in some way, manipulate your own emotions. And on the other hand, what we think of as rational is not at all rational. Our rational side of our mind is not at all rational. There's a lot of biases and little shortcuts and things that are the opposite of logical that are going on there. So yeah, that's the kind of the basic structure of that course. That you might think that there's emotion and there's the passions and there's the rationality, but in fact the passion is much more rational than you think, and rationality is much more passionate than you think. And I think that's actually Kubrick is a great example for how how the two things are very much intertwined all the time.
So I want to just sort of pull back a little bit and talk about when we talk about divine inspiration. Obviously, we're talking about some kind of generative force outside of us, presumably a higher force. And this brings to mind the idea of free will and determinism, in that if there is some divine being there that's suddenly, breathing inspiration into us, then it must be not only divine, but somehow preordained. And that then brings the idea of free will. Now, I'm someone who, when I talk to people who don't believe in free will and are determinists, to me, I think of supernature. These are people who believe in supernatural things, and they're going to, they most likely, if they're being consistent, believe in Bigfoot and Sasquatches roaming around in in the forest. They would believe in little, or the Loch Ness monster, or little fairies that come in the middle of the night and molest you, incubi, succubi, all this kinds of things. What is your take on free will in creativity? Because to me, you can't have creativity if you don't have free will. And if you disagree, what is your counter proposal to it?
So, so you lost me a little bit. So you said that what is the analogy of believing in Bigfoot and Sasquatch?
That's super. It's
Believing in free will?
supernatural. It's a belief in supernatural, and the way you would believe. To me, I think believing in a God is a supernatural. I'm a
Yeah.
naturalist. I'm a materialist.
Yeah, I fully agree. But what you're saying is that free will does not exclude free will. First, I thought you were saying that believing in free will is like believing in Sasquatch. That's not
No,
what
no,
you're
no,
saying.
no, no. The
The
opposite.
opposite of
Yeah,
what you're saying.
yeah.
Okay, good. So most people these days, right. So there's the big question: free will or determinism. So if I want to, I can raise my right hand or I can raise my left hand. That seems to be free will, right? I can do this. On the other hand, we also know that really what's happening is that in my brain there's this one neuron that fires and that is connected to this other neuron that because of that also fires, and that seems like a deterministic perspective. So most people these days they don't deny free will and assert determinism, or they don't deny determinism and assert free will, but they try to combine the two.
Yeah.
So that's the
Compatibilism.
mainstream these days, compatibilism. Exactly. And my own view about this is that it seems like, well, for much, it's not just about free will and determinism, but in much of how we engage with the world, there's our everyday picture of the world, which very much includes our free will, that I'm free to do this. But also there's the scientific view of the world, where I do know that really what's going on in my brain is just kind of mechanistic firing of neurons. And these are two very different perspectives. But here's a different example, objects. So here's this glass, seems like a solid glass. I can knock on it and so on. On the other hand, science tells me that that's not actually the case. This glass is not solid. It's just a bunch of atoms in very far away from each other. That's the case. We know that that's the case. That's what's happening in here. Much of it is just empty space. Much of this thing that seems very solid is empty space.
It's the illusion of solidity with electromagnetic force holding it together.
Exactly. And so how do you kind of combine these two perspectives? And in some sense, so when I teach, I always try to ask my students why should we study philosophy when we have science, which I think every philosopher should ask themselves. Why should we study philosophy of mind when we have psychology? Why should we study philosophy of biology if we have biology and so on? And I think one thing that philosophy is very good at is to try to give us some kind of ideas about how these two images of the world relate to each other, right? So you have this kind of everyday picture of the world where I'm free to raise this hand or free to raise the other hand. There's the scientific picture of the world where what's happening in the brain is this kind of mechanistic one neuron firing after the other neuron. How do these two things relate to each other? How can these two pictures of how things are be so different from each other? I think that's a very important topic for philosophy that science is not going to be able to touch, because science is stuck in the scientific image. And what philosophy is good at is to relate the scientific image to the everyday image and see how they are related to each other. And I think when we think about the free will versus determinism question, that's exactly what we should do, to relate these two different ways of seeing the world to each other.
So every day now, if you're looking online, people are pushing artificial intelligence, that it's going to solve this, that, or the other thing. I interviewed a fellow recently, and I've done 3 or 4 interviews over the years regarding artificial intelligence, but not specifically towards creativity. So let me approach that with you. It seems to me that the very idea of artificial intelligence is getting very cult-like, religious-like intonations that we're going to get to artificial general intelligence and then super intelligence, and we're going to advance 1,000,000 years in just 10 hours or something. And what does that really mean? Are we going to all of a sudden get faster than light speed and be able to build rocket ships that go halfway across the universe in a day? Now, apropos art and creativity, though, if we do remove the divine from divine inspiration, uh, it seems to me that artificial intelligence is going to serve at least a good purpose in the sense of that it'll help us maybe understand our own generative forces, because clearly we're different, and you're never going, even if we have people who become cyborgs, you know, the neurons that are biochemical, they may have analogs, or you can make theoretical analogs in a computer simulation, but it's not going to be that thing. Your Aunt Maria's apple cake, the smell of that comes back to you, and artificial intelligence is never going to be able to know exactly what that's like. Just like we're not going to necessarily know exactly what it's like, assuming that you will have real consciousness and intelligence there. So where do you stand on artificial intelligence and creativity? Do you see this as a way to give a mirror to look into what human creativity is about? Are you apprehensive about it? What?
Good. So this is a huge topic, and especially these days in aesthetics, it's a big question about whether artificial intelligence can create artworks, or whether it's capable of artistic creativity. And of course, a big question is, well, now that artificial intelligence can solve math problems, whether they are capable of mathematical or scientific creativity. I've been trying to keep a safe distance from the whole buzz about artificial intelligence, because I feel that the actual science, the actual technology of artificial intelligence is changing so quickly that you can't, as a researcher, you can't really keep up unless you are working at Google or something, where it's actually happening. So I feel that on the basis of what I know about the artificial intelligence systems that we now have, it doesn't seem that creativity is really a possibility at this point. But of course, that in 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, 20 years, it might be all different, because who knows what's going to happen in terms of the technology. But again, on the basis of what I have been seeing, that's not doesn't seem like there's much creativity.
But when you talk about creativity, are you referencing that specific to what we know of human creativity? Because yes, I mean, I've seen some of the AI stuff, and it's in a sense laughably bad. There's bad writing that you can immediately. My wife's a copywriter. She says she can see bad AI copywriting right away versus bad human copywriting. But there comes a certain point when it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, talks or quacks like a duck. It's a duck. So if for whatever, however it is done, if you get artificial intelligence creating things that are, to use like the Turing test, that are almost indistinguishable for even the great critics or artists to say whether that was made by a computer or a human being, does then that become, that alternate pathway to creativity?
Well, yeah, good, but that's again, that kind of takes us back to where we started. What is creativity, right? How do we spot creativity, and who is to tell whether something is creative or not? So there was a kind of a study that made quite a splash, maybe half a year ago, maybe a little longer ago. People at the University of Pittsburgh were doing this study of poems that were created by artificial intelligence versus poems that were not created by artificial intelligence. And it seems like a lot of people, including not complete novices, they rated the poems that were written by artificial intelligence as higher than the poems that were written by humans, and including poems that were that are ontologized, that like big huge things. So who's again, that takes us back. Who's to tell? I mean, maybe some people would deem that those things are more creative. In the kind of creativity research, there's a lot of disagreements about what creativity is, but everyone seems to be agreeing on is that creativity does have these two features that it must have, that it might have more, it might need to have more, but it needs to be novel, it needs to be somehow positive, good, better than what was before. And it's the novelty aspect that I think is an issue with artificial intelligence, which is how novel is it going to be. So when it comes to ChatGTP, we know that the novelty is very limited. But you could, of course, say, and I expect you to say this because you're very quick with your answers, is that, well, in some sense, of course, humans, they're not capable of having like completely novel things. When I come up with a metaphor, it's coming from somewhere in my mind, right? There must be some kind of precedent of it. So it's a big question, it's a very complicated question about just what kind of novelty is required for creativity. But I do have the sense that, again, on the basis of the systems that I have seen, artificial intelligence systems that I have seen, the kind of novelty that it's capable of creating is very limited.
Well, just so you know, and for anyone watching this, I will link below this video not only to Bence's university page, but I'm going to link to about in 1998, a fellow came over to film me writing a sonnet. I did that in 100 minutes, and as I'm putting together the 14 lines, I'm explaining where and why I chose this. I had lines and ideas, and I'm going through, and so I write a sonnet in just 100 real-time minutes, and so you can look for that below here. But as you were talking, I did want to talk about something that I saw a video 6, 7, 8 months ago where a political analyst was talking about Donald Trump, and he made an interesting point because Donald Trump, most people will say rightly, is not that intelligent of a person, with one exception. He's clever. Yeah, he's like the monkey that cleverly is able to hide a little banana away from his troop so that he can survive any coming storm or whatnot while the rest of his monkey pack dies off. And cleverness is, I think, often mistaken for real creativity. And by cleverness, I mean it's that ability to be able to do something in a minor fashion to benefit yourself immediately. Whereas creativity, especially in the arts, but also to a degree in sciences, is about outward. How does it benefit more than me? If I have this bit of wisdom and I'm Herman Melville and I've just spent 5, 6, 7 years on a ship, I want to be able to project out not only into the world that I'm living in, but the worlds that are to come, what it was like to be on a ship, to be with men, what that camaraderie was like, what a life and death situation was like. So to me, creativity is about pushing things outward into the world, whereas cleverness is using a little bit of intelligence that you might have to just boost a small part of yourself. Do you delineate something different between, as I've described it, cleverness versus creativity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in creativity research, people they make all these distinctions, of course, as people would. So creative work is different from a creative person, is different from a creative act, right? And of course, a creative work is, in some sense, by definition, something that's pushed outside, as you were saying. It's something that's outward looking, that you write it down because you want some people to read it. But the creative act itself, and some people think that that's also what I think, is that that's the most basic concept of creativity. That's not in itself. I'm not sure that it in itself that is outward looking.
No.
You can have a creative act that you're never going to share with anyone else. That doesn't make it not creative. Let's just say that. So I would be reluctant to build the condition of somehow disseminating into creativity itself.
Well, that's sort of like, when Franz Kafka died, he supposedly wanted his best friend to destroy his manuscripts. But why the hell would he write them? I mean, as an artist, I'm like, come on, I know this kind of manipulative game. I've known enough artists, that I don't want my stuff out there. I'm just doing it. No, I mean, art to me is the highest form of communication. Like I said, if I'm Melville and I want to give an idea of what life was like in this time, in this place, in that way, I'm going to write Moby Dick. So I think a lot of that when people have some masterpiece that they haven't put out. I mean, if you didn't have Theo Van Gogh, would he have the works of Van Gogh? At a certain level, he knew though that his brother knew the business more than he
Yeah,
did. So he
yeah.
can say, "Oh, I'm just the pure artist," but he had his brother to take care of the nitty gritty to get him out there.
Well, good. So that's a good point. That probably very few artists. I mean, yeah, yeah, you're right about it. But I mean, I thought we were talking about creativity and just the creative act itself. Yeah, I mean, we're
Yeah.
completely in agreement that when if you're an artist, it's got to be something that kind of pushes you to want other people to engage with your art. If you're not, then that's difficult to know why you're an artist. But creativity itself, and there's a famous quote that's attributed to Mozart when he talks about how when he writes music, what's happening is that he just hears the music in his head,
Yeah.
and then writing it down, committing it to paper, as he said, is a completely secondary and not at all part of the actual creative act. The creative act is when he hears the music in his head. And then when he writes it down, let alone it being performed, that's just somehow external to the creative act itself.
Well,
So I think that that's
Alfred Hitchcock was like that too. He said to him the final screenplay was it, and then he didn't want to really be bothered about filming it, but he had to make money for his backers.
exactly, yeah. Although of course with Hitchcock, you never know
Yeah.
what was just marketing, what he's saying and what was true. But yeah. So it's so because of that, I think maybe less depends on what you do with your creative act and the creativity itself. I did want to talk about like three more things that I think are very
Okay.
important in relation to these things. One is that there's some research on creativity and psychedelics,
Mm.
and that it seems like some psychedelics have some impact on creativity. I mean, maybe that's not something you want
Is
to get
that just
into.
in releasing inhibitions?
Well, it's a big question. What it is that makes it so, and so I wanted to go back to a much bigger topic that I think might explain the whole psychedelic stuff, and that goes back to your example actually when you talked about these two unrelated ideas that that you suddenly somehow see connected with each other, because another thing that seems to be very heavily correlated to creativity is something that you might call just how fragmented your mind is.
Mm-hmm.
So people differ in how fragmented their mind is, by which I just mean that how separate different corners of the minds are kept from each other. If your mind is very fragmented, then it's going to be very difficult to connect to different ideas because one of them is going to be in this fragment that's kept somehow far away from the center here, and the other one is going to be kept here, and there's not going to be any possibility of connection. If your mind is less fragmented, if there's more of a kind of a unity of your mind, then it's going to be much easier to have kind of seemingly unrelated ideas connect to one another. And then one way in which you can explain the whole psychedelic thing is not just by less inhibition, but because there's some defragmenting effect, let's just say that, going on in the case of psychedelics, some unification of separate parts of the mind. So that might be an interesting thing. That also might explain why we tend to fall into this fallacy of divine intervention.
Well, isn't that though? You're adding something to the neurons or the structure of the brain, and you can do that even without psychedelics. I know there have been times when I worked overnights and I've been writing at night and it's 3:30 in the morning and I'm tired as hell. But if you keep pushing it, all of a sudden, bam, you get something that you wouldn't get an idea that you wouldn't get if you were perfectly rested. So you're in a sense you're still dopamine or whatever might be firing in the brain at that moment is doing something. But I wanted to ask too though before we go, the initial impulse to be creative and then to be artistic, because I would say artistic is separate from just the mere creativity. For example, if we're cavemen and we're in France 40,000 years ago, I've just come home, killed a mammoth, and we're gonna feed the extended clan and tribe. And the women there are braiding the young girls' hairs, and they're using little seashell things to put in there. That's an act of creativity to make them more sexually desirable to the next generation. Me and my hunter guys, after we've cooked the mammoth, we're gonna take the tusks of the mammoth and we're gonna make little doodahs or whatnot, maybe in celebration of our god. And then another one of our tribe is going to put his hand there and spit the paint or the blood so it makes his signature or whatnot. What do you think drove that? Is it just merely that the mind of a human beings got to a point where they need more than just the everyday, and maybe it's only 1 in 20 of us that needs that, but that do you think that as the genesis of the artistic creative impulse?
Yeah, so that's a big, huge topic in cultural evolution of art. Why did art evolve? Right? It's a very time-consuming and energy-consuming activity. Why do humans do it?
Mm-hmm.
You could be hunting more mammoths, or you could be cooking more food, or you could be doing whatever helps your reproduction more. So it seems like a waste of time. So, and as a lot of people say different things, so one big, huge theory, something that you refer to, is that it's sexual selection. So the idea is that if you're doing art, then you're going to be much more likely to attract suitable mates. If you braid your hair the right way, if you tattoo yourself the right way, then that's going to be more attractive to the opposite sex. I'm a little skeptical about these things, a little simplistic explanations, I think, or at least for it to be a universal explanation about why we have art. In general, I would be very reluctant to give like one monolithic kind of explanation that this is the sorry. Apologies. Just to have one monolithic explanation of why art evolved. There were probably various different kinds of reasons especially for different art forms. For music, that might be very different from visual arts, and might be very different for literary arts and so on. So if you see an explanation that, well, art evolved because of X, I think you should be very, very skeptical.
But then that would seem to me to be the very easy explanation why people think of divine inspiration, because it is it is a one size fits all thing.
Very good. Maybe we came in circles. Very good.
Well, just in closing, is there anything you'd like to say on the subject of creativity or the like that you think is not represented well enough in current modern thought?
I think this idea about just how connected your mind is in relation to that, to creativity, I think that's a very important topic, and especially the relation to attention. This is something that I guess we did not talk about, but I think it would be a very important thing to think about, just how because there's a very famous experiment about how when your attentional resources are elsewhere, it's going to be very difficult to be creative. So creativity is something that requires attention.
Yeah.
So there's very famous experiments that people were doing these very complicated tasks of long division, and then after that they had to write an essay, and then it was always much less creative than if you did not have to write the long divisions. So I feel that the link to attention, which is very, very much connected to the idea that I said before about how fragmented your mind is, I think that's a very important angle to understanding creativity. And the more and more we understand about how attention, especially perceptual attention, works, the more we're going to be able to understand about how creativity works.
Well, Benson Ane, thanks for spending about an hour speaking.
Thanks so much. That was fun.